Hey guys. Tonight we slip into the quiet shadows of dimly lit palaces and whisper through corridors that once echoed with the clumsy fates of kings and queens, who, let's be honest, probably shouldn't have gotten out of bed that day. Welcome to the silky-voiced chaos of bizarre royal deaths. Yes, the crown may be shiny, but it's also cursed with irony, slippery tile floors, and more goose fat than should be legal in any skincare routine. You're about to learn that history, especially the kind you sleep through in school, is secretly one giant blooper reel. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a Roman bathhouse, but not just any. You're elbow deep in steamy, perfumed water beside Elagabalus, the teenage Roman emperor whose hobbies included confusing the Senate and dying in oddly domestic fashion. Though Elagabalus was assassinated at 18, his baths were legendary, lined with marble, steaming with rose oil, and frequented by peacocks. So it's no surprise that later monarchs took bathing as seriously as politics, sometimes more so. Fast forward to King Edmund Ironside, 11th century England's unlucky warrior king. Some say he died heroically in battle. Others, not so much. One theory insists he was murdered in his privy, yes, the royal toilet, by an assassin hiding underneath. You squat there for a moment, imagining the awkward logistics. Historians still argue whether this bizarre tale was mere Saxon smear campaign or darkly comic reality. In France, King Henry II's death offers another slice of morbid slapstick. He was jousting in honor of his daughter's wedding, a festive event with enough banners to suffocate a rhinoceros, when a lance shattered and pierced his eye. The splinters lodged deep, and, despite doctors using gold-threaded linens and solemn mumbling, he lingered in agony for days. If you're wondering whether eye trauma is a fun topic in bed, the answer is firmly no. But let's ease into a softer demise. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, a monarch whose reign was so unremarkable, they called him King who ate himself to death. In 1771, he dined on lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and finally, 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semla buns soaked in hot milk. He died hours later. You can practically feel the food baby. Historians still debate whether it was the bun or the royal gluttony that did him in. But the kitchen staff probably never looked at whipped cream the same way again, slipped deeper into the steam. It's getting warm now. You pass Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife to King George II. She had a hernia, simple enough. But instead of a quiet surgery, she insisted on continuing royal duties, corseted so tightly it compressed her organs. She collapsed mid-audience and never recovered. Doctors blamed her melancholy humors, because of course they did. Meanwhile, the corset industry rolled its eyes and moved on. One lesser-known tale leads you to Emperor Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire. He died in 1740 after eating mushrooms. That's it. Mushrooms. Possibly poisonous. Possibly just not cooked properly. Historians still argue whether they were toxic or just badly timed leftovers from his hunting trip. Either way, the empire, destabilized, people panicked, and mushroom risotto saw a brief decline in aristocratic popularity. But no royal slip-tops King James II of Scotland, who died when a cannon exploded during siege practice. He was so eager to show off his new fancy artillery that he stood too close. Boom. A fiery misfire, one leg gone, and with it the king. You scoot a little farther from any imaginary cannon in your room, just in case. And remember poor Emperor Valerian of Rome, captured by the Persians in battle. He was allegedly used as a human footstool by King Shapur I. After Valerian died, possibly from neglect, possibly from just giving up, his skin was allegedly stuffed and displayed. Historians still debate whether this was wartime propaganda, or the most gruesome upholstery project in ancient history. A gentler ending? Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. She died days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. The irony: she was the only wife he truly mourned. You picture candlelight flickering over heavy Tudor tapestries, and the uneasy quiet that follows a royal birth. And death. Finally, as your limbs get heavier and your breathing slows, you glide past the tale of Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Officially, he died of typhus. Unofficially, he faked his death, became a monk, and lived anonymously for decades. The monk, Fyodor Kuzmich, appeared mysteriously in Siberia with oddly noble manners. His handwriting matched Alexander's. Historians still argue whether it was real escape or elaborate myth, but you have to admit, it beats dying on a moldy mattress in a drafty palace. So there you are, adrift in the murky waters of royal mortality, where too much pudding, too little caution, and the occasional cannonball mark the thin line between power and punchline. You pull the blanket up just a bit. Steam clings to your imagination. A peacock screeches in the distance. Or maybe it's just a very confused pigeon outside your window. Either way, you're only one semla bun away from history repeating itself. You push open a heavy, creaking banquet hall door, and the scent hits. You first. Roasted game, honey-glazed roots, and enough spices to bankrupt a small kingdom. You're about to attend royal feasts so elaborate they had courses dedicated entirely to gilded fruit sculptures. But don't get too comfortable. The dining table, for some monarchs, was more lethal than any battlefield. You pull out a chair beside King Martin of Aragon, circa 1410. He's doubled over in laughter, his jester having just told a scandalously bad joke involving a goose and a priest. Moments later, Martin is dead. Officially, indigestion. Unofficially, a fatal combination of laughter and overconsumption. He just polished off an entire goose. Historians still debate whether it was a heart attack, a ruptured organ, or the universe saying, "Too much goose, your majesty." Next plate. King Henry I of England, the youngest son of William the Conqueror. He adored lampreys, those slippery jawless eels that look like nightmares with teeth. His physicians begged him to stop eating them. He didn't. One final lamprey feast in Normandy, and he was dead within days. The cause? Allegedly, a surfeit of lampreys. There are few phrases in the English language more absurdly royal than a surfeit of lampreys. You imagine a medieval doctor shaking his head slowly, wiping eel slime off his sleeve. Slide a few seats down to the doomed banquet of Charles VI of France. Not the mushroom guy, the other unlucky Charles. During a ceremonial dinner, he suddenly declared himself made of glass. He refused to move or be touched, convinced he'd shatter. This wasn't a death, but more of a psychological nosedive with a side of roast duck. Charles suffered from what historians now call the glass delusion. Whether it stemmed from lead poisoning, madness, or just one too many royal obligations, no one agrees. But it definitely killed his reputation, and his dinner parties got way more awkward after that. You nibble on a candied fig while watching King Eric XIV of Sweden paranoia sweat through his final meals. After being deposed, he was imprisoned and repeatedly warned not to trust the food. Smart advice. He was eventually poisoned, likely with arsenic, hidden in a bowl of pea soup. You're not sure what's more unsettling, the method or the fact that medieval peasants often died for pea soup while this guy died from it. You lean over to sniff a wine goblet. Just checking. Because you're now beside Pope Clement II. Not a king, but papal dining rooms had their share of deadly secrets. He died mysteriously in 1047, and modern forensics suggest his remains contained shocking levels of lead. Possibly from his wine chalice. Then there's Tsar Peter III of Russia, who had a known obsession with beer and toy soldiers, and a less-known tendency to make enemies of literally everyone. After being overthrown by his wife, Catherine the Great, he was imprisoned and died soon after a sudden illness following dinner. Some say poison, some say a pillow. Some say he never saw it coming because he was too busy marching tin figurines across the floor. You peer around a candlelit table set for Emperor Jovian of Rome. His reign barely lasted 8 months, less than your average student lease. He was found dead after dinner in a tent filled with charcoal braziers. Carbon monoxide poisoning is the suspected culprit, but others whisper of assassination. Historians still debate whether it was an accident or the earliest known case of deadly camping. Speaking of short reigns, you dine next with Alexander of Greece. No, not the great one, the other one. In 1920, this poor king got into a scuffle trying to break up a fight between his dog and a monkey. The monkey bit him. He developed sepsis and died. Royal protocols forbid commoners from seeing him, so proper medical help was delayed. You blink slowly. Bitten by a monkey in peacetime in a royal garden. The modern Greek monarchy never really recovered from the sheer weirdness. Lurking nearby is the tragic figure of Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson. Though his death wasn't from food, his public image suffered from feast-related satire. Political cartoons often mocked his vacant expression and dinner habits. His sudden death at 28 from influenza sparked conspiracy theories. Syphilis? Foul? Play? Jack the Ripper? Historians still argue, but it was enough to make Buckingham Palace double-check the soup temperature. And just when you think things can't get more absurd, King Philip I of France chokes. On what exactly? No one agrees. A piece of meat? A bone? A fig? The only certainty is that he died red-faced and gasping at a feast. You imagine the horror of a silent, stuffy room as the king flails and nobility pretends not to notice. Too polite to intervene. Too terrified to do nothing. You sidle past a few safer meals and overhear a footman whisper that even Napoleon's stomach was suspicious. He died on the remote island of St. Helena, officially from stomach cancer. But high arsenic levels in his hair sparked decades of poisoning theories. Some historians blame the wallpaper. It was laced with arsenic-based dye. Imagine dying because your decor was too trendy. And remember Adolf Frederick from last section? He returns here, belly full of semla buns, groaning and dramatically declaring, "I die." You picture the court physician just nodding, quietly folding his napkin, and writing that one down. You yawn. You feasted alongside monarchs, most of whom couldn't survive a dinner course without peril. The lesson? Never trust your jester, always question the soup, and maybe skip the extra mushroom topping. You shuffle away from the banquet hall, belly metaphorically full and fingers still sticky with imaginary fig glaze. Now, you find yourself among thrones, not majestic gleaming seats of power, but the awkward literal chairs that sometimes did the killing. And tonight, one in particular comes with a rather explosive ending. You're in ancient China now, standing quietly behind Emperor Jing of Han. He's perched delicately on his elaborately carved wooden throne, lacquered, red, practically a fire hazard with legs. He sneezes once, adjusts his robes, and that's the last peaceful moment he'll know. Why? Because buried inside this throne, according to one fringe tale, was a hidden trap intended for an assassin. Ironically, he triggered it himself. Scholars mostly roll their eyes at this one, but still, the symbolism is tempting. Shift now to King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. He was assassinated at the age of 16, stabbed multiple times in a room where he'd been lounging in his ceremonial throne chair. Here's the kicker. He was wearing robes too long for quick escape, and likely had indigestion from a royal luncheon. Historians still argue whether it was a botched political coup, or the world's most inconvenient wardrobe malfunction. You glide to medieval Scotland, where King Alexander III galloped into the darkness in 1286. He ignored the advice of everyone. Classic, royal move, and rode out in a storm to be with his queen. He fell from his horse near a cliff edge, possibly breaking his neck on the way down. The throne, it turns out, sometimes waits in patience, knowing its next occupant is one thunderstorm away. Now imagine sitting beside the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man obsessed with bodily functions and strange experiments. He once sealed people in rooms to see if the soul could be observed leaving the body. Nice dinner party energy, right? While Frederick didn't die from flatulence, he did have multiple seizures after a particularly gluttonous day, and one chronicler notes that his final moments were exceedingly gaseous. A scholarly term, no doubt. You stifle a giggle as you overhear a tale of King Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad. He was ill, bedridden, and his physicians wrapped him tightly in brandy-soaked cloth as a sort of royal cure. The final step was to sew the linens closed, but instead of a needle, the nurse used a candle to burn the threads shut. The brandy ignited. The king burst into flames, and that was that. You can still smell the smoke curling off royal dignity. Move slightly west to King Louis IX of France, Saint Louis no less. During a crusade, he allegedly succumbed to dysentery, but not before attempting to command his army from a golden throne mounted in the middle of a dusty camp, surrounded by flies. There's a particular image of him giving orders between episodes of severe stomach cramps that stays with you a little too long. Historians argue whether his death was holy martyrdom or just a tragic case of bad drinking water. Then there's Edward II of England, whose death in 1327 is possibly the most debated and grotesquely imagined in medieval history. Officially, he died in captivity. Unofficially, a rumor began to spread involving a red-hot poker and some very private royal anatomy. Many historians dismiss it as political propaganda, but the image has lingered for centuries. And if nothing else, it's a reminder that the medieval imagination had zero chill. You quietly sit behind Emperor Nero as he lounges in Rome's Domus Aurea, his golden house. Nero fancied himself a singer, a god, and occasionally a competent ruler. But once things turned sour, he fled and asked a servant to kill him. The servant hesitated, and Nero, true diva to the end, stabbed himself partially before the servant finished the job. His dying words? "What an artist dies in me." He probably would have demanded a Spotify channel if he'd lived another 1,000 years. Now over to Denmark, where King Christian VII was known more for erratic behavior than governance. Possibly schizophrenic, possibly a victim of court manipulation. He once reportedly leapt onto furniture mid-meeting and performed cartwheels. He wasn't killed in an accident, but the court was a minefield of embarrassment, intrigue, and whispered jokes about whether his throne should have come with a seatbelt. Meanwhile, King George II of Great Britain makes a particularly royal exit. He died on the toilet. Technically, an aortic aneurysm ruptured while he was doing his morning business, and he collapsed with such force that attendants found him in a most undignified pose. It's whispered he groaned something before hitting the floor, but nobody agrees on what. Historians love the idea of this orderly, punctual George losing to the bowel gods. You turn the page on time again and land softly beside King William III, who died from complications after falling off his horse, tripped by a molehill. That's it. The fall broke his collarbone, infection set in, and soon England was in political upheaval. Loyalists would later toast to the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat, their nickname for the mole. Yes, the mole got posthumous credit for regicide. Historians still squabble over whether the fall really caused the death or just sped things along. And finally, Queen Sunanta Kumari Ratana of Siam died in a boating accident in 1880. Her vessel capsized in the Royal Canal, and though palace guards were nearby, they were forbidden by law to touch a royal body. So they watched as she drowned, unable to lift a hand. You pause there, the silence thick. Tradition can be deadly, even in silk robes and lotus-scented water. So many thrones, so much irony. You rest your head a little heavier on your pillow, remembering that power might elevate you, but it also makes your fall that much farther, especially if there's a mole at the bottom. You step cautiously through the fog of ancient battlefield smoke and royal paranoia, where betrayal has the scent of wine and steel, and the next fatal decision often wears a velvet cloak. In this section, you'll drift beside kings and queens who met their end not through poison or dinner plates, but through blade, betrayal, and what can only be described as really bad vibes. First up, King Richard III of England. You find him standing awkwardly in his armor, back hunched, crown askew, and sword slick with sweat rather than blood. The Battle of Bosworth is underway, and he's yelling famously for a horse. What he gets instead is a halberd to the head. His body is later buried in a parking lot, literally, under what is now a car park in Leicester. Historians still argue whether he was the hunchbacked villain of Shakespeare's imagination, or just really bad at public relations. Next, you eavesdrop on the whispered downfall of Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I and would-be Queen of England. She wasn't killed per se, but her attempt to claim the throne led to a civil war known as the Anarchy. At one point, trapped in a castle, she escaped disguised as a corpse. Face covered in ash, robes soaked in funeral linen. As you might guess, not the comfiest outfit. Though she lived, her royal claim died there in the snow. You tuck that away, as possibly the worst royal winter look in history. Onward to the Russian Empire, and the infamous fall of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. You're in the basement of the Ipatiev house, Yekaterinburg, July 1918. The family is told they're being photographed, so they line up, awkward, blinking, trusting. What follows is chaos. Bullets ricocheting off walls, bodies collapsing. Historians still debate the precise motivations, orders, and timeline. But one thing is clear. It was an end both orchestrated and unhinged. A sobering moment. Even your breath feels too loud. Just before the echoes fade, you're whisked to Scotland again. Mary, Queen of Scots, is climbing the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. She's calm, regal, even though she knows the axeman will botch the job. And he does. The first swing only wounds her, the second nearly finishes it, the third severs the last. Her little dog, hiding in her skirts, refuses to leave the headless body. You wonder if anyone at the English court ever truly slept again after that. Probably not. Certainly not Queen Elizabeth I, who signed the warrant. Now for something messier. Emperor Commodus of Rome. You've seen him in films. Gladiator-loving, delusionally divine, and very into fighting shirtless. After alienating everyone, including the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and presumably the local tailor, he was strangled by a wrestler in his bath. Historians still argue whether poison failed first, or if the wrestler was just Plan B. Either way, not the ending he'd imagined for his heroic saga. Nearby, Prince Dipendra of Nepal commits one of the most shocking royal acts in modern history. In 2001, he gunned down almost the entire royal family, including his own parents, before turning the weapon on himself. He survived in a coma for 3 days, and due to Nepalese law, was technically king during that time. King while unconscious, killer while conscious. The monarchy never recovered. You blink hard at the tragedy's scale. It's so fresh, so recent, it buzzes differently in your chest. Back in England, you're watching Henry VI, weak, pious, and totally unfit for rule. He's imprisoned in the Tower of London. One quiet evening in 1471, he's found dead. The official cause? Melancholy. The unofficial one? Probably a dagger to the skull. No autopsy, of course. Too scandalous. Historians still debate whether Edward IV had him quietly removed, or if Henry simply expired from accumulated royal embarrassment. You pass through thick, oily air into Renaissance Florence and witness the rise and bloody fall of Alessandro, de' Medici. He ruled with swagger and cruelty, believing himself untouchable. Until one evening, a cousin invited him to a friendly midnight gathering. The cousin then stabbed him multiple times in the neck. The motive? Power, revenge, and possibly romantic jealousy. You lean back and think, never accept an invite after 11 p.m. from someone who smiles too much. Then there's King Faisal II of Iraq. In 1958, a coup led by military officers took the young monarch from his palace to a courtyard, where he was shot, along with his entire family. He was just 23. The last king of Iraq. The black and white photos that remain capture a prince who never had time to grow into his crown. And you wonder if he knew, when he put on his uniform that morning, that it would be for his final portrait. One more betrayal for your list. Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Despite what Hollywood insists, she did not seductively whisper into a snake's ear. She most likely poisoned herself with a toxin-laced comb or hairpin. After the defeat at Actium and the death of Mark Antony, she locked herself in a mausoleum, refused Roman humiliation, and chose her own ending. Still, scholars debate whether she died by her own hand or with Octavian's secret permission. You note that even in death, she preserved her brand. Step into the eerie hush of France, 1793. You hear the drumbeat of revolution. King Louis XVI climbs the scaffold, the crowd roaring, equal parts grief, rage, and bloodlust. The guillotine gleams. His head falls. Months later, his wife Marie Antoinette follows. Her execution is somehow worse. Her hair hacked off, her face swollen with grief. The very people who once painted her in silk now cheer her decapitation. You murmur a quiet yikes and keep walking. And let's not forget the bizarre near miss of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. He lived through assassinations, revolutions, and family tragedies. But the throne never quite swallowed him. Instead, everyone around him died. His wife stabbed, his brother executed, his son a suicide. A domino line of sorrow, with Franz Joseph awkwardly outlasting them all. It's as if history couldn't decide when to cut the curtain. As you wrap your mental list of betrayals and blades, you feel the room dim a little. There's a chill. Royalty is rarely about splendor. It's about survival. And the higher the throne, the sharper the knives in the crowd. You drift now into a quieter chamber. Well, quieter for the moment. The smell of parchment and ink wafts in like an academic ghost, because what you're stepping into is a world where death wasn't delivered by sword or scheme, but by illness, ignorance, and a medical toolkit that basically amounted to good luck and hold still. First up, King Henry III of England. The year is 1135, and Henry is in Normandy, aging but spry. One evening he tucks into a plate of lampreys, those eel-like fish that look like something a nightmare might shed. His doctor had warned him not to. Henry, like many royals, ignores medical advice with gusto. He eats too many, gets violently ill, and dies within days. The official term was a surfeit of lampreys, which is possibly history's classiest way of saying he died from binge-eating the seafood version of vacuum hoses. Historians still argue whether it was the fish or something sneakier. Poison? Maybe. But that's the joy of royal death. It's always a little slippery. Next, you watch Queen Anne of Great Britain navigate a life filled with pregnancies, 17 of them, and only one child who lived past infancy. Even he died young. Anne died in 1714, likely of complications from gout, obesity, and constant grief. Her swollen body, by then so inflamed, made movement agony. Her final days were spent bloated, aching, and surrounded by doctors who didn't understand half of what they were treating. And yet she reigned. The first sovereign of Great Britain, who probably would have given it all up for a quiet moment and a functioning immune system. Speaking of tragic queens, let's tiptoe into the court of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or Sisi, as she was called. A beauty icon, a myth in her own lifetime, plagued by melancholy and rituals so obsessive they make your bedtime routine look like amateur hour. She died not in illness, but after an anarchist stabbed her with a thin file. So thin she didn't even realize she'd been stabbed until moments later. It wasn't the method, but her reaction, calm, confused, almost gentle, that breaks your heart. She apologized to her maid as she collapsed. Can you imagine? Bleeding out while saying, "I'm sorry for the trouble. Now you're with King Charles II of England, the merry monarch." Not so merry near the end. In 1685, he suffered what modern doctors suspect was uremia or kidney failure. But in his final days, the medical team administered a greatest hits album of bad ideas. Bleeding, purging, emetics, blistering agents, and a red-hot enema for good measure. That's not even a joke. The poor man was cooked inside and out by a team of well-intentioned sadists. Historians still argue whether the treatments helped speed along what may have been a very treatable condition. Spoiler: they probably did. And now to the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Ibrahim I, known as Ibrahim the Mad, spent much of his reign in seclusion before being placed on the throne. Already mentally unstable, he made increasingly erratic decisions, like choosing his concubines based on body weight, one famously weighed over 300 pounds, and ordering mass executions over petty court squabbles. Eventually, his own court had him strangled with a bowstring, the preferred Ottoman method of royal removal. But it's the lead-up, days of paranoia, pacing, and whispering in corners, that chills your spine more than the act itself. Meanwhile, Peter the Great of Russia, yes, the towering reformer, died not in battle, but after a long and horrifying urinary infection. It got so bad that doctors had to perform emergency surgery to drain his bladder without anesthesia. Multiple times. His last words were reportedly, "Give all this to," and then he died mid-sentence, possibly the worst cliffhanger in royal history. Let's peek in on Charles VIII of France, who meets his end in 1498 while walking through a low door frame. That's it. He smacks his head on a stone lintel and collapses. Some accounts say he got up and walked away, only to die hours later. Others say he dropped instantly. Either way, a door frame ended a monarchy. Historians still argue if it was an aneurysm that coincided with the bump, or if France's architecture just decided to rise up. Either way, you're probably ducking a little more when passing through doorways now. Over to the east, Emperor Go-Momozono of Japan, who died in 1779 at age 20. No swords, no scandal, just smallpox. That tiny invisible virus claimed hundreds of royals across centuries. Go-Mamazono died with no heir, so they adopted one posthumously to avoid a succession crisis. Imagine dying young, and your relatives scrambling to fake a family tree before the ink dries on your death certificate. King Gustav III of Sweden earns his place in this chapter for being shot at a masquerade ball in 1792, an event so dramatic it later inspired an opera. He survived the initial bullet to the back but died 2 weeks later from sepsis. His costume was a magnificent white and silver ensemble, which probably made him easier to spot. You nod, mentally adding, "Don't wear shiny stuff to political events to your list of survival tips." There's also Queen Victoria, who didn't die young or violently but aged slowly, wrapped in black after Prince Albert's death. She outlived most of her children and ruled through waves of change. When she finally died in 1901, it was after a stroke. They buried her with her husband's robe and a lock of her servant John Brown's hair in her hand. Yes, the one the royal family pretended never existed. Even in death, she had secrets stitched into her fingers. And what about Alexander the Great? Conqueror of the known world, dead at 32 in Babylon. Some say it was fever, others poison, others paralysis. A fringe theory says he had Guillain-Barré syndrome and was fully paralyzed but still alive when his body was prepared for burial. Let that one swirl in your brain as you stare at your ceiling fan. Maybe history's greatest general was buried alive in silence, conscious but unable to scream. As you sink deeper into your sheets, surrounded by the ghosts of monarchs and their tragic final days, a strange peace settles over you. Maybe it's the absurdity. Maybe it's the sheer scale of human frailty. But you feel it now. No crown, no empire, no jewel can outshine the brutal, unpredictable, and often ridiculous ways a human body can say, "Nope, we're done." You shuffle now into a chamber not lit by candlelight or the flash of swords, but by something weirder, something darker. You're entering the zone of alleged curses, mysterious disappearances, and the kind of deaths that make even sober historians glance over their shoulders. Welcome to the part of royal history where logic packs its bags and flees the palace. Let's open with the House of Habsburg, whose genetic history reads like a warning label. You watch Charles II of Spain pace his lonely palace halls, born with a jaw so deformed he could barely chew. Charles was the product of generations of inbreeding so intense it basically rewrote his DNA like a bad script. He suffered from multiple illnesses, infertility, and a mind that seemed to flicker in and out of clarity. When he died in 1700, childless and barely functioning, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Historians still argue whether he was a tragic individual or the final product of a family that simply wouldn't stop marrying their cousins. Either way, you whisper a gentle yikes for genetics. Now the curse allegedly placed on the Romanovs. You hover over the cradle of Tsarevich Alexei, son of Nicholas II. He has hemophilia, a royal disease so infamous they might as well have given it a throne of its own. The slightest bruise could kill him. Enter Rasputin, the bearded enigma, healer, mystic, and walking scandal. He seems to ease the boy's pain, and that power grants him terrifying access to the royal family. But Rasputin is assassinated in 1916, poisoned, shot, drowned, possibly all three. His body took so long to die, some thought he was possessed. and 2 years later the Romanovs are massacred. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether the curse was just political mismanagement, but you can't help but wonder if Russia's blood-stained snow remembers. You pause beside the deathbed of King Tutankhamun. Not technically a European royal, but no list of mysterious regal demises is complete without him. He dies young, around 18 or 19, with a fractured skull, a broken leg, and traces of malaria. Fast forward to 1922. Howard Carter opens the boy king's tomb, and then deaths start to follow. Lord Carnarvon, who funded the dig, dies from a mosquito bite that gets infected. The lights in Cairo go out. His dog howls and drops dead back in England. The newspapers eat it up. The mummy's curse becomes a full-blown craze. Rational minds dismiss it as coincidence or colonial superstition. But there's something in the silence of that tomb, isn't there? Something that makes the hairs on your arms rise. Let's not skip over the princes. In the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. You're now inside the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. It's 1483. The boys have been declared illegitimate, and their uncle, Richard III, has taken the throne. Then, silence. The boys vanish. No official record, no public execution, just gone. 2 skeletons, found centuries later beneath a staircase, may or may not be theirs. Historians still argue. Was it Richard? Henry VII? Someone else entirely? The only clear thing is the absence, and you can almost hear it echo. Shift now to Louis XVII, the lost Dauphin of France. You're with him in a dank prison cell after his parents' execution. The boy is sick, silent, and alone. Officially, he dies in captivity in 1795. But rumors erupt. He escaped. He was smuggled out. He grew up somewhere else under a new name. Dozens of imposters later, DNA testing finally closes the case. Maybe. Probably. Still, the myth lives. A small child, vanishing into revolutionary smoke, leaving behind a question mark. Another monarch tangled in mystery. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. He drowns in 1190 while crossing a river on campaign during the Crusades. But the legend goes further. Some say he never truly died. That he sleeps in a cave in the Kyffhäuser Mountains, his beard growing through a stone table, waiting to rise again when Germany needs him most. You picture that, a king beneath a mountain, snoring through centuries of empire and collapse. Less creepy, more cozy, but still part of this royal graveyard of myths. You drop in on Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, whose death in 1889 sparked one of Europe's great tragic scandals. He and his lover, Baroness Mary Vetsera, are found dead at the Meyerling hunting lodge. Officially, a murder-suicide. Unofficially, a mess. Conspiracy theories include political assassination, double murder, and even a faked death. The Habsburgs tried to suppress the details, of course. That always helps. Historians still debate what truly happened in that snowy lodge. But one thing is clear. No good comes from royals and secluded cabins. Let's get weirder. Princess Diana. Not a monarch, but royalty nonetheless. You're in Paris, 1997. A Mercedes speeds into a tunnel. Crash, fire, sirens. Diana dies hours later. The world stops. Then the questions begin. Paparazzi? Drunk drivers? Seatbelts? MI6? Theories fly. Some credible, some outlandish. Even decades later, people debate whether it was a tragic accident or something darker. What's certain is how her death shook the very image of royalty, made it mortal, fragile, human. And yes, we must circle back to Rasputin. Again. Because his death is the definition of mysterious. Poisoned cakes and wine didn't work. Shot in the chest, still alive. Shot again, tied up and dumped in a freezing river. Only then did he stop moving. Or so the story goes. Some claim his lungs had water, meaning he drowned. Others say it was all exaggerated. Historians still argue about the exact order of events, but the imagery, wet beard, unblinking eyes, bullet holes and all, that sticks. Then there's Emperor Norton III, not officially royal, but San Francisco's self-declared emperor in the 19th century. He wandered the city in regal garb, issuing proclamations, demanding bridges, and charming everyone. When he died in 1880, thousands came to his funeral. Was he mad? A genius? Both? His life and death sit at that lovely crossroad of fantasy and reality. As you linger in this murky realm of maybe murders and alleged curses, you start to feel the pull of your pillow a little more. There's something deliciously exhausting about chasing ghosts, about wondering what's real, what's forgotten, and what's been quietly buried because it made someone uncomfortable. And that's the thing about royal death. It doesn't always arrive with a trumpet or a dagger. Sometimes it creeps in on the back of a rumor, waits in the shadows, and leaves just enough behind to keep you awake wondering. Now you shuffle a little deeper into the folds of time, letting your fingers brush against velvet robes and rustling, legal parchments. This is the gallery of scandals, where monarchs didn't so much die with dignity as they stumbled into dramatic exits paved with treason trials, personal betrayals, and oh-so-messy politics. If you thought monarchy was about duty and decorum, buckle up. We're now in the courtroom of chaos. Start with Mary, Queen of Scots. You're with her in Fotheringhay Castle, 1587. She's been imprisoned for 19 years by her cousin, Elizabeth. Mary's been accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth. Just one of many schemes to restore Catholic rule in Protestant England. After a shadowy trial and a signature that Elizabeth definitely signed while holding her nose, Mary is sentenced to die. On the morning of her execution, she wears red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. The first axe stroke misses her neck. The second one barely does better. The third finally severs it. And when the executioner lifts her head, her wig comes off. In his hand, her real hair is gray and cropped. The entire room gasps. There's no recovery from that. Historians still argue whether Mary was genuinely involved in the plot or simply the scapegoat of a terrified cousin. But you feel it, don't you? The blade, the stage, the silence after the fall. Now peek into the life of Edward II of England, the most unkingly king to ever upset a baron. Born into opulence, he preferred rowing boats and hanging out with his male favorites. That, plus a lack of battlefield ambition, infuriated his nobles and even his own wife, Isabella. Eventually, she and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded England. Edward was imprisoned and, legend says, killed by the insertion of a red-hot poker. No marks, you see, so no murder. Though modern historians doubt the story's hardware, they do agree his death was ugly, humiliating, and probably involved screaming. Not the royal send-off anyone dreams of. Hop forward to Tsar Paul I of Russia. Paranoid, volatile, and known to rearrange military uniforms just for the fun of it. By 1801, the Russian nobility has had enough. Late one night, a group of officers storms into his bedroom. There's a struggle, a snuffed-out candle, and then he's beaten and strangled with a sash. Officially, it's reported as apoplexy, an old-timey word that covers everything from a stroke to a bunch of nobles hit him with a chair. His son Alexander takes the throne and does nothing to punish the murderers. Funny how that works. You wander now into France, where Louis XV is waiting, nervous and round-shouldered, for his date with the guillotine. It's 1793, and the revolution has already claimed his authority, his power, and half his hairline. He mounts the scaffold, tries to speak, but the drums drown him out. The blade falls. His head is held high, his body twitches, and someone allegedly dips a handkerchief in the blood. The crowd roars. The monarchy is dead. Except, not really. Historians still argue whether the execution was necessary or if it created a martyr out of a mediocre monarch. Either way, you're probably rubbing your own neck now. Just a little. Over to Napoleon Bonaparte. Not technically a king, but crowned emperor by his own hand, so let's not split historical hairs. After years of conquering Europe, he's exiled to the island of St. Helena. He dies in 1821, possibly from stomach cancer or slow arsenic poisoning. Hair samples taken years later show elevated arsenic levels. Was it his wallpaper? A vindictive jailer? An inside job? The debate goes on. But picture this. The most powerful man in Europe, now pacing a rocky island, scribbling memoirs to the wind, dying not on a battlefield but in slow, pathetic decay. Don't worry, it gets messier. We drop in on Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King, builder of fairy tale castles and composer fanboy. By 1886, he's declared insane and deposed. The next day, he and his psychiatrist go for a walk by a lake. Hours later, both are dead in shallow water. No autopsy, no witnesses, just speculation. Suicide, murder, mutual misunderstanding with tragic results. Historians still argue. But imagine the scene. A silent lake. Royal footsteps vanishing in wet grass, and then nothing but ripples. Next door, Austria's Crown Prince Rudolph makes a second appearance because Mayerling wasn't just a death. It was a scandal bomb. His double suicide with his young mistress throws the monarchy into a tailspin. The church refuses to bury him in consecrated ground, then suddenly reverses course after the Habsburgs lean in with their generous interpretation of mental instability. Ah, canon law. More flexible than you'd think when royalty is involved. Now let's peer through the smoky curtains of Persia. You see Nasser al-Din Shah Qajar, modernizer, autocrat, and lover of photography. In 1896, during a pilgrimage, he's shot by a revolutionary. As he bleeds out, his last words are reportedly, "I am not feeling well." Understatement of the century. His assassination wasn't just political. It symbolized the clash between old monarchy and a brewing constitutional movement. His death sparked waves of reform, and also a lot of nervous royals doubling their bodyguards. Over in Italy, King Umberto I is gunned down by an anarchist in 1900. The assassin was reportedly avenging the victims of a massacre the king had praised. But here's where it gets weird. Umberto had met a man shortly before who looked exactly like him, had the same name, and ran a restaurant. Both were born on the same day. That doppelganger died the same day the king did. Coincidence? Probably. Creepy? Absolutely. Swing by Belgium now. King Leopold II dies in 1909, unloved by the public. Not because of personal scandal, but because of the grotesque horrors he inflicted on the Congo Free State. His death is followed by people jeering in the streets. The church refuses him a state funeral at first. Not every royal death is tragic. Some are deeply deserved. And finally, turn to Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. Not a king, but father to one. After being exiled during a military coup, he wanders Europe, eventually dying alone and mostly forgotten. His son, Prince Philip, consort to Queen Elizabeth II. You wonder, what's it like to go from exiled refugee to royal in-law? To live your life as a sidebar and then, years later, be reabsorbed into monarchy like a long-lost puzzle piece, as you let these tales settle around you, these betrayals, strange exits, and whispered last words. You begin to see the throne for what it is, a velvet-lined trap. The higher you sit, the farther you fall. And sometimes, it's not the fall that kills. It's the landing, especially when it's in front of everyone. You move now through a corridor lined not with portraits or battle flags, but with clocks, ticking softly, ticking slowly, like a lullaby gone slightly off beat. You're in the royal retirement wing now, the sad little back room where monarchs who didn't die in glory or scandal simply fizzled out. Welcome to the forgotten endings. The post-scepter shuffle. The slow fade to black. First you shuffle into the shadow of Queen Victoria's final days. By 1901, she's been queen for over 63 years. Her empire spans continents, but her health is slipping fast. She's lost 9 of her children, her beloved Albert decades earlier, and she's nearly blind and partially deaf. She retreats to Osborne House, a favorite island escape. There, surrounded by family, and a surprisingly touching letter from her long-dead servant John Brown in her hand, she slips away into the soft hush of evening. It's not dramatic, just old age. But still, you feel the weight of it. The longest reigning monarch in British history, until Elizabeth II, vanishing quietly into a fog of morphine and memory. Then there's King George III. Yes, the Mad King of American independence fame. In his youth, he's composed, cultured, a lover of agriculture and botany. But later in life, things begin to fray. He talks to trees. He writes in long, loopy bursts of nonsense. They say his urine turns blue, a sign of porphyria maybe. though historians still argue whether it was that or bipolar disorder. By the time he dies in 1820, he hasn't really been king for a decade. Just a husk in Windsor Castle, blind and babbling, listening to imaginary conversations with long-dead friends. If he's remembered, it's usually for losing the American colonies. But here, in this soft twilight of history, you wonder what he really lost. His throne, his mind, or something far deeper. Now your steps echo through the quiet chambers of Portugal, where King Manuel II waits out his exile. He's only 19 when revolution sends him fleeing in 1910. No war, no dramatic assassination, just a suitcase, a steamer, and a long goodbye. He settles in England, then France. Never returns. Never tries. He becomes a bibliophile, a footnote, the final flicker of a fading dynasty. When he dies of a throat infection in 1932, barely anyone notices. No coup, no comeback. Just a throat infection and the end of a line. Royal, yes. But so human it's almost painful. Meanwhile, you take a seat beside France's Louis XVI, who takes the throne after Napoleon's fall. Technically a king, but in practice, more like a placeholder. He's obese, chronically ill, and spends much of his reign either trying to please no one or offending everyone. He dies in 1824, reportedly of gangrene so bad the palace staff had to air out his bedroom. His final words are rumored to be about soup. Not liberty, not glory. Soup. And honestly, kind of relatable. Cross now to Sweden, where King Gustav V reigns for 43 years, then fades quietly in 1950. His death is natural. His legacy, complicated. He's accused of sympathizing with Nazi Germany, though he also tries, ineffectively, to help Jewish citizens. Historians still argue about his intent, but when he dies, it's not on a battlefield. It's in bed, likely from a heart attack with no grand farewell. He simply stops being. Now peek at the awkward fate of King Umberto II of Italy. Poor guy reigns for 34 days. That's it. A single month in 1946 before a referendum boots the monarchy entirely. He goes into exile in Portugal and never returns to Italy. Not even in death. He dies in 1983, a monarch in name only. His reign shorter than most people's New Year's resolutions. Historians politely refer to him as the king who never reigned, which, you have to admit, feels like the punchline of a very dry, royal joke. And then there's King Edward VIII, the original royal dropout. In 1936, he abdicates the British throne to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American. Scandal. Headlines. Furrowed brows from Buckingham to Boston. But in the years that follow, his life becomes one long, awkward cocktail party. He's never quite welcomed back, never quite cut off. He dies in 1972 in Paris. No throne, no children, just Wallis and a stack of unanswered questions. Historians still argue whether he was a romantic hero or a Nazi sympathizer in Kashmir. You lean toward both. A moment now with the Kaiser. Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, flees to the Netherlands after World War I. He chops wood obsessively, writes angry letters, and tries to ignore the fact that the monarchy is gone forever. When Hitler rises, Wilhelm is unimpressed. He calls the Nazis common. But he never returns to Germany. He dies in 1941, in exile, having outlived his empire but not his illusions. They bury him in Dorn, wrapped in imperial flags. No one sings. Now, imagine the last emperor of China, Puyi, installed as a toddler, dethroned as a teen, then briefly reinstalled by the Japanese as a puppet leader of Manchukuo. Captured by the Soviets, later imprisoned by the Chinese communists, and eventually released to work as a humble gardener in Beijing. Yes, gardener. The emperor who once ruled over millions now trims hedges and tends chrysanthemums. He dies in 1967 during the Cultural Revolution. His memoirs published posthumously. You picture him there, watering plants, remembering thrones. Closer to our time, you linger with King Michael IV of Romania. He's forced to abdicate by the communists in 1947. He spends decades in exile, driving commercial planes and selling chickens for a living. Finally allowed back in the 1990s, long after communism crumbles. He's greeted like a celebrity by people who never knew him as king. He dies in 2017, aged 96. A king out of time. A monarch returned, just in time to wave. And as you sit with these stories, monarchs who didn't die in drama or fame, but in dusty villas, modest apartments, and quiet beds, you start to feel the hush behind the crown. There's something eerily soothing about it. The long exhale, the final twilight, no bells, no fire, just a whisper. It's over. You're getting comfortable now. More still, more weightless. The palace corridors are behind you. The blood-soaked battlefields a distant hum. But don't get too cozy. You're about to enter the weirdest wing of the royal mausoleum. The utterly absurd. The you can't make this up end-of-life oddities. In here, kings and queens meet their maker through sheer ridiculousness, sheer misfortune, or both. You ready? Probably not. Let's begin with King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, whose death reads like a cautionary tale from a glutton's diary. It's 1771, and he decides to indulge in a royal feast. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. And for dessert, 14 helpings. Yes, 14 of his favorite dish. Semla buns soaked in hot milk. Now, you might think this ends with, and then he took a nap. Nope. He dies. From indigestion. Possibly a heart attack. Possibly his stomach just gave up and resigned. He's now lovingly remembered in Sweden as the king who ate himself to death. Historians still argue whether it was the semla or the sauerkraut that tipped the scales, but either way, it's hard not to admire the commitment. And now we stumble over to King Alexander of Greece. It's 1920. And he's enjoying a stroll in the royal gardens when his dog gets into a scuffle with a monkey. He tries to break it up, but the monkey bites him. He gets infected. Gangrene sets in. A monkey bite kills a king. No assassination. No rebellion. Just a very upset monkey and an unlucky afternoon walk. What's worse? He was a temporary monarch, holding the throne while the Greek royals were in political limbo. His death throws the monarchy into chaos, arguably altering Greek politics for decades. From monkey bite to national crisis. That's Quite a legacy. Step lightly now through medieval Denmark. You come upon King Erik Fee, stabbed at a barnyard assembly, possibly over a tax dispute. But it's his descendant, King Hans, who makes the list for weirder reasons. Hans loved to joust, even well past his jousting prime. In 1513 he takes a tumble from his horse and injures his leg. The wound festers, days pass, the infection worsens, and soon he's gone. A royal taken out not by treason, but by stubbornness. Historians still argue whether he was intoxicated or just impressively reckless. Either way, never joust after 50. Next up, Charles II of Navarre, aka Charles the Bad. The nickname doesn't do him justice. This guy was basically medieval chaos incarnate. But his death? Shockingly ironic. In 1387, he's so ill they wrap him in brandy-soaked cloth to warm his body. Standard medieval weirdness. Then a clumsy servant tries to trim the cloth with a candle. The brandy ignites. Charles goes up in flames, literally. Alive. In bed. On fire. It's like a royal ghost story told by someone who'd had a little too much wine. Back in England, let's visit William III. Yes, the Protestant hero. The man who brought constitutional monarchy to Britain. The instrument of his downfall? A molehill. Seriously. While riding in Hampton Court in 1702, his horse stumbles on 1. William falls, breaks his collarbone, and soon develops pneumonia. He dies not in battle, not in court, but courtesy of a clump of unassuming dirt. Ever since, Jacobites, supporters of the rival Stuart line, have toasted the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat, a poetic euphemism for the mole, because even monarchs, it turns out, are one clumsy horse away from irrelevance. Slip over to Bavaria for a tale involving King Otto, brother to Mad King Ludwig. Otto spent much of his reign under regency due to mental illness. He lived in near total seclusion and was eventually buried in a small chapel far from grandeur. But here's the kicker. When the monarchy was formally abolished, Otto was still technically king, though he had no idea. A monarch who reigned in total unawareness. It's not a death of violence or indulgence. It's just tragic absurdity. You picture him pacing gently, mumbling to no one, wearing the crown only in his mind. And then there's Charles VI of France, aka Charles the Mad. At one point, he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. But it was a particularly warm day in 1392 when he fully snapped. He killed 4 of his own knights in a frenzy, then blacked out. He spent the rest of his reign drifting in and out of lucidity, often failing to recognize his own wife and children. He died in 1422, having lost his grip on both sanity and power. Historians still argue whether he suffered from schizophrenia, a neurological disorder, or something else entirely. You wonder what it would be like to be both king and terrified of your own limbs. Swerve now to the mighty Roman Empire. You meet Emperor Caracalla, a cruel and paranoid ruler who's killed his own brother to secure power. One day in 217, during a roadside bathroom break, yes, even emperors have to pee, a disgruntled soldier stabs him from behind. A real don't turn your back on the latrine moment. If this were fiction, you'd call it juvenile. But nope, the mighty Roman ruler taken out mid-pee. You may never visit a roadside bush the same way again. Drift forward to the 1700s, and the curious case of King Stanisław Leszczyński of Poland. He lives out his later years in Lorraine, France. In 1766, while reading near the fireplace, his silk robe catches fire. Too frail to put it out, he burns badly. Infection follows, and that's that. Another monarch claimed not by war or poison, but fashion and flammability. It's almost as if royalty and open flames were never meant to mix. We float to modernity with an almost slapstick note. King Albert I of Belgium, beloved mountaineer and national hero, dies in 1934 during a solo climbing expedition. He falls from a cliff. Some say accident. Others murmur about foul play. Historians still argue over the evidence, or lack thereof. Either way, the only king to die mid-hobby. Gravity as his final rival. And finally, a quiet chuckle for King George II of Great Britain. In 1760, he gets up early, drinks hot chocolate, and then dies on the toilet. Possibly an aortic aneurysm. Possibly royal karma, but he becomes the first, and still only, British monarch known to have died mid-bowel movement. Yes, this is your legacy when you rule an empire, remembered not for treaties or wars, but for an inconveniently timed trip to the loo. You pause, now surrounded by royal ghosts who slipped not on swords, but banana peels, who met their end by pastry, pest, or porcelain. And in the dim light, you almost hear them laugh, quietly, ruefully. Because even the crowned cannot escape the ridiculousness of being human. The night deepens, and you slip further into this tapestry of monarchs who didn't just die. They stumbled, slipped, or found their final moments tangled in strange fate. You come upon one story that's less about chaos and more about haunting mystery. The death of Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. You stand on the edge of the Ural Mountains, in a small, dimly lit cellar, where Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their children spent their last hours. The Bolsheviks had taken them captive in 1917, ending centuries of Romanov rule in a seismic shift. They were held here, in the Ipatiev house, under strict guard. On a cold July night in 1918, a firing squad entered and executed the entire family, but the details are fogged with secrets. Historians still argue about the precise order of the shooting, the whereabouts of their remains for decades, and whether the youngest daughter, Anastasia, really survived as legend claimed. The fascination with their demise isn't just because of the violence. It's the echo of an empire collapsing, the end of divine right monarchy, and a dynasty extinguished in the shadows. The chilling fact that the execution happened while the world above was at war, oblivious. You feel a shiver as you imagine the silence after the shots, broken only by whispers, regrets, and the sweep of history moving forward. From revolutionary Russia, you drift south to the Italian peninsula and the curious case of Queen Joanna I of Naples, a queen whose life was a knot of intrigue, betrayal, and rumor. In 1382, she mysteriously disappears. Some say she was poisoned. Others whisper she was strangled. But the strangest theory? That her ghost still haunts Castel dell'Ovo, Naples' ancient fortress, wandering the battlements in a blood-stained gown, Scholars debate whether her death was murder or political suicide, but locals swear on moonlit nights they hear her cries over the waves. You wander next to the enigmatic tale of King Olaf II of Norway, known as Saint Olaf after his death. His final battle was at Stiklestad in 1030. But historians still argue whether he actually died in battle or was assassinated shortly after, under the cover of chaos. His death sparked a wave of Christianization across Scandinavia, making him more legend than man. You imagine the clash of swords and the echoing hymns sung to honor a king who may have died not with a heroic shout, but a whispered prayer. Now, drift to the tiny principality of Liechtenstein. Prince Franz Joseph II ruled quietly through the tumultuous 20th century, dying in 1989 at the ripe age of 83. His reign was unremarkable in the usual royal drama sense, but he was one of the longest reigning monarchs in Europe. His death was natural, peaceful, and without scandal. Yet it marked the end of an era, a reminder that not all royal deaths are marked by pomp or tragedy. Some simply drift away, leaving behind a quiet legacy. Next, you glide to the British Isles again, this time to King Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. For centuries, his death was wrapped in myth. The villainous usurper, the Hunchback King. But in 2012, archaeologists discovered his remains under a parking lot in Leicester, challenging centuries of assumption. His death was brutal and messy, but also a real human moment. Broken bones, a violent end. Historians still argue about his character, but his physical death reminds you how mortal power really is. Cross now to Ethiopia and Emperor Haile Selassie. Deposed in 1974, he died under mysterious circumstances in 1975, reportedly strangled in his prison cell. Officially, it was a heart attack. The debate rages. In Japan, Emperor Hirohito died in 1989 after a long reign marked by war and peace. His death was calm and carefully choreographed, a national moment of mourning. Yet historians still argue about his wartime role. Was he a puppet or a power player? His passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of a modern Japan. You feel the solemnity in the air. A collective breath held, then released. From there, you slip to King Louis XVI of France, guillotined in 1793 during the Revolution. His death is one of the most famous royal endings, but what's less known is his last meal, 2 boiled eggs and a cup of broth. A small, quiet moment before the terrifying blade. Historians still argue whether he was doomed by fate or by his own indecision. You imagine the heavy silence before the fall, the crowd's roar muffled by the weight of history. Finally, you drift toward the modern day and the passing of King Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand in 2016. Revered for 7 decades, his death was a national moment of grief. He died quietly in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, after a lifetime of service. Unlike many royal deaths, his was marked by profound respect and mourning, with millions across the nation paying tribute. His passing feels like the gentle closing of a chapter, a peaceful transition in a turbulent world. And so, surrounded by these final moments, some violent, some absurd, some serene, you sense a common thread. Behind every crown is a mortal story. Not all are heroic, not all are dignified, but all are human. And maybe that's the strangest, most comforting truth of all. You drift onward, wrapped in the soft embrace of history's shadows, as the story of royal deaths continues to unfold with equal parts solemnity and oddity. There's a rhythm to these endings, a beat that pulses between grandeur and the everyday, reminding you that behind the pomp is always something more fragile, more human. Take King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King you've heard whispers about before. His fascination with fairy tales and castles often seems like a daydream escaping the strict duties of royalty. But his death is shrouded in mystery. In 1886, he was found drowned in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist, under circumstances that still baffle historians. Was it suicide, murder, or an accident? Historians still argue whether his death was part of a tragic ending to a lonely life or a sinister conspiracy. You imagine the mist on the lake, the quiet ripples, and the unanswered questions drifting just beneath the surface. Next, you find yourself in Scotland, contemplating Mary, Queen of Scots. She was executed in 1587 after years of imprisonment, her life marked by political intrigue, failed marriages, and a religious tug-of-war. Her death by beheading was swift, but not without drama. Legend says her executioner botched the first strike, and she had to endure a second blow. The macabre detail is jarring, but the broader debate lies in whether she was a victim of political necessity or a pawn in a dangerous game. You picture the chill in the air that day, the crowd's hushed anticipation, and a queen facing her end with remarkable dignity. Farther east, you stumble upon the story of King Sejong the Great of Korea, who died in 1450. Known for his wisdom and the creation of the Korean alphabet, his death was from natural causes, but historians still argue about his health in his final years. Did stress and political pressure hasten his decline? You can almost see the aging king, surrounded by scholars and advisors, the weight of a kingdom pressing down as he quietly slips away. It's a reminder that sometimes the end is not marked by violence or scandal, but the slow fading of strength. Jumping forward to the bizarre death of King Henry I of England, who reportedly died after eating a surfeit of lampreys, a type of fish he loved too much. In 1135, the king indulged in the dish, despite warnings that it was bad for his health. Shortly after, he became violently ill and passed away. It's a royal cautionary tale about gluttony and ignoring good advice. Historians still debate the exact cause. Was it food poisoning, a stroke, or something else? You imagine the royal kitchen bustling with cooks unaware they were cooking the king's last meal. From there, you float toward the ancient kingdom of Egypt with the death of Cleopatra VII. Famously, she died by suicide, allegedly by the bite of an asp, a venomous snake. The imagery is iconic, but historians still argue whether she actually used a snake or poison in some other form. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire. You can almost smell the incense and hear the soft rustling of silk as she chose her own fate, a queen in control until the last moment. Across the Mediterranean, the strange demise of King Zog I of Albania stands out. He survived multiple assassination attempts, but ultimately died peacefully in exile in 1961. His story is one of resilience and tragedy, fleeing his homeland and living out his days far from the throne. You sense the loneliness beneath the glamour, a man who lost a kingdom but kept his dignity. Next, the death of Queen Victoria, who reigned over a vast empire for over 6 decades. She died peacefully in 1901, but her passing sparked the end of an era. Her deathbed was reportedly surrounded by family, with the soft ticking of clocks and the fading light. Historians still argue about how her prolonged mourning shaped the British monarchy's public image. You can feel the slow closing of a chapter that defined an age of empire, industry, and cultural shifts. Then, the untimely death of King Tutankhamun in ancient Egypt. He died around age 18, and his tomb's discovery centuries later sparked worldwide fascination. Theories about his death vary wildly: illness, accident, or even murder. Historians still argue whether a chariot crash or genetic defects led to his early demise. You picture a young boy king, taken too soon, his mask shining bright but his life shrouded in mystery. Now, to Emperor Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, known for his terracotta army. His death in 210 BC was due to natural causes, but it's rumored he sought immortality through dangerous potions, possibly poisoning himself unknowingly. The irony isn't lost. A ruler obsessed with eternal life who died from his quest for it. Historians debate the impact of these potions on his death, and you imagine the eerie silence descending on the grand mausoleum as the emperor's body lay still beneath the earth. Finally, a quick stop with King Gustav III of Sweden, shot during a masquerade ball in 1792. The king's death was slow and painful, and he lingered for days before finally succumbing. The assassination was politically motivated, and the whole event sounds like a plot from a thriller. Masked guests, hidden, daggers and royal betrayal. You feel the tension of the ballroom turning from celebration to tragedy in an instant. As you lean back, feeling the weight of centuries and the whispers of royal ghosts, you realize that death, for all its certainty, is still wrapped in mystery, drama, and sometimes a touch of the absurd. And as you prepare to drift further into sleep, remember, the crown does not shield against the strange ways the world ends. As you drift deeper into the quiet folds of night, you find yourself transported to a string of royal exits that blend tragedy with an unexpected twist of fate. Each story a reminder that history's grand stage often has a flair for the dramatic and the downright bizarre. Consider King Alfonso III of Spain, who ruled through turbulent times and finally went into exile in 1931. He died quietly in Rome in 1941 from complications of diabetes. Yet the path from king to exile was marked by a tumultuous abdication and political upheaval. Historians still argue whether his reign was doomed from the start or simply a victim of the rapidly changing world. You can almost feel the weight of a fading monarchy, a crown left behind in the dust of progress. Cross to the Persian Empire, where the death of Xerxes stands as a blend of history and legend. Officially assassinated by his own courtiers in 465 BCE, some stories suggest a ghostly curse haunted his tomb, terrifying successors. Historians still debate the circumstances. Was it political betrayal, a palace coup, or divine wrath? The layers of myth wrapping his death remind you how storytelling colors the facts, turning a king's fall into legend. Journey to the island kingdom of Hawaii, where King Kamehameha II unified the islands in the early 19th century. He died in Das in 1819, reportedly peacefully in his sleep. But the real intrigue surrounds the traditional Hawaiian belief that his spirit still roams the islands, protecting them. This spiritual legacy contrasts sharply with many monarchs' violent ends, reminding you how culture shapes the memory of death. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Osman II was strangled by Janissaries in 1622 after attempting to reform the military. His death is notable for its brutal irony, a young ruler trying to modernize but ending up the victim of those he sought to change. Historians still debate whether his reforms would have succeeded or only accelerated his downfall. The story of Queen Elizabeth I of England closes another chapter. She died peacefully in 1603 after a long and storied reign. Yet, her death sparked an unprecedented succession crisis, with no direct heir. Historians still argue whether her refusal to marry was political genius or personal tragedy. The silence after her death was loud enough to echo through centuries. In India, Emperor Akbar the Great died in 1605 after an extraordinary reign. His death was from natural causes, but his legacy of tolerance and cultural fusion left an indelible mark. Historians debate whether his empire's eventual decline was due to weak successors or external pressures. You feel the grandeur of a lost golden age and the quiet passing of its architect. The bizarre end of King Canute IV of Denmark contrasts sharply with these legacies. He was murdered by rebellious peasants in 1086, supposedly after a mass he held. An ironic end for a saintly king. His death sparked rebellion and sanctification, blurring the lines between martyrdom and political upheaval. You sense the roughness of medieval life, crashing into royal ideals. Switch continents to the African kingdom of Buganda, where Kabaka, Mwanga II was executed by British colonial authorities in 1903 after resisting imperial rule. His death marked a painful transition, the death of a king intertwined with colonial conquest. The tension between tradition and imperialism lingers like a ghost over this chapter. Back in Europe, King Charles VIII of France died in 1498 after hitting his head on a door lintel during a game of tennis. Yes, tennis. The sheer randomness of his death feels almost comical until you realize how it reshaped French politics. Historians still debate whether his death was purely accidental or hastened by underlying health issues. Either way, it's a royal reminder that life's dangers sometimes lurk in the most mundane places. Then there's King Mswati II of Swaziland, whose reign ended peacefully, but whose burial customs include rituals that echo ancient traditions. His death reminds you that royal exits aren't just about how kings die, but how they're remembered and honored. Culture, ceremony, and memory intertwine in a rich tapestry. In the Habsburg dynasty, Emperor Charles V died in 1558 after a long abdication and retreat into a monastery. His death from natural causes contrasts with the often violent ends of his ancestors. Yet his legacy of ruling a vast empire makes his quiet passing almost poetic. Historians debate whether his retirement was forced or chosen, a royal surrender or peaceful acceptance. Finally, you arrive at the story of King Peter III of Aragon, who died in 1285. likely from dysentery during a military campaign. His death reminds you of the ever-present shadow of disease in history, even for those in power. It's a stark contrast to the royal deaths by sword or poison. Sometimes it's just the common cold or worse that claims the crown. As you settle deeper into the night, you feel the strange comfort that these endings, so varied and human, bring. Royalty or commoner, power or exile, the final curtain always falls, in its own peculiar, inevitable way. As you sink deeper into this gentle descent through time, the air thick with stories of kings and queens who face their final moments under the weight of history's spotlight, you find yourself drawn to tales where royal deaths veer into the surreal, the eerie, and the just plain weird. Take, for instance, the curious case of King George III of England. You probably remember him as the Mad King, a label that sticks unfairly to a monarch who ruled during the American Revolution. His death in 1820 came after years of mental illness, which many historians now attribute to porphyria, a rare blood disease. Yet, there's a fringe theory that he was poisoned by his own doctors, who misdiagnosed and mistreated him. Historians still argue about his condition and the impact it had on his reign. You can almost hear the ticking of the clock in his chambers, the quiet confusion mixing with regal dignity as his mind faded. Next, consider the bizarre and tragic demise of Queen Ranavalona Freed of Madagascar. She ruled with an iron fist from 1828 to 1861 and was notorious for her ruthless purges and superstition-fueled executions. Her death, however, was quietly peaceful from natural causes, but historians debate how much her tyrannical policies contributed to her kingdom's isolation and eventual colonization. Imagine the eerie silence that replaced her once thunderous decrees. Then there's the almost mythic death of King Harald Hardrada of Norway. He died in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, famously falling to an arrow to the throat. The image of the last great Viking king dying in battle sounds straight out of an epic saga, but historians still debate the exact circumstances of his death. Was it a sudden arrow, a fatal wound after the fight, or something more dramatic? You can almost hear the clash of swords and the roar of the crowd fading into quiet sorrow. Jump to the tropical realm of Tonga, where King George Tupu V died in 2012, reportedly after a short illness. His death was marked by both mourning and celebration of a monarch who embraced modernization while respecting tradition. The curious part? Tonga's unique system of succession and the way his passing triggered both political and cultural shifts. Historians still debate how monarchies can balance tradition and change in the modern world. Further back in time, the strange death of King Edward II of England is an infamous tale. He was allegedly murdered in 1327, with one gruesome legend claiming a red-hot poker was used to kill him. A story so bizarre it's hard to believe, but it stuck around. Historians argue whether he was actually killed in this way or quietly assassinated. The mystery around his death echoes through the centuries like a dark fairy tale. You then drift to the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Justinian Thor's death in 565 marked the end of an era of grand architecture and legal reform. His death was peaceful, but historians still debate how much his ongoing wars and the plague of Justinian weakened the empire before he died. You can picture the silence in the Hagia Sophia, the crowning jewel of his reign, as the emperor took his last breath. From Byzantium to France, the tragic end of King Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, adds a haunting note. His bouts of insanity are well documented, and he died in 1422 after years of mental instability. Historians still argue about how his illness affected the 100 Years' War and the fate of France. You can almost feel the weight of madness hanging heavy over the court. Over to India, the tale of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's death in 1833 is different. It wasn't royal blood, but his status as a reformer made him a prince of social change. He died abroad, far from his homeland, sparking debates about the cost of exile and reform. You sense the quiet melancholy of a visionary lost too soon. The death of King Charles XIV of Sweden is another chapter wrapped in mystery. He died during the Great Northern War in 1718, reportedly shot during a siege. But historians still argue whether it was enemy fire or an assassination by his own men. The uncertainty adds a cloak of intrigue over his warrior king legend. Meanwhile, in Japan, the death of Emperor Meiji in 1912 symbolized the transition from feudal Japan to a modern state. His passing was peaceful, but the impact was seismic, sparking debates about imperial power and modernization. You can almost hear the traditional drums mixing with industrial sounds as the old and new worlds collided. Finally, the bizarre story of King Frederick IV of Denmark, who died in 1730 after an illness supposedly caused by overindulgence in alcohol, wraps this section with a bit of royal human flaw. Historians still argue whether his lifestyle hastened his death or if political stress played a bigger role. You picture a king with a hearty laugh and a cautionary tale about excess. And as you close your eyes, letting these tales swirl softly in your mind, remember that behind every royal death is a story layered with truth, myth, and the human condition. Sometimes tragic, sometimes ridiculous, always captivating. You continue to drift gently through the labyrinth of history, your mind floating among stories of kings and queens whose deaths were as peculiar and revealing as their lives. The path now takes you to moments when royal exits sparked not just mourning, but deep political tremors, cultural shifts, and even a few moments of poetic irony. Let's start with the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, whose fate is a stark reminder of how quickly fortune can turn. His execution in 1918 by Bolshevik forces was brutal, ending centuries of Romanov rule. Historians still argue over whether Nicholas could have saved himself or his family by fleeing earlier, or by making political concessions. You imagine the cold, dimly lit room where the family's final moments unfolded, a heavy silence hanging in the air, shattered by a gunshot that closed an imperial chapter. From icy Russia to the tropical courts of the Khmer Empire, you reach King Jayavarman VII, who died in the early 13th century. His death was likely peaceful, but his reign was marked by massive building projects, like Angkor Thom, symbolizing both power and piety. Historians debate how his death affected the empire's stability and the eventual decline of Angkor. You can almost hear the rustling leaves of the jungle reclaiming temples as centuries pass. Then there's Queen Anne of Great Britain, who died in 1714 after a reign filled with personal tragedy and political union. her death without surviving. Heirs triggered the Hanoverian succession, forever changing British monarchy. Historians argue whether her physical ailments or emotional distress hastened her death. Picture the quiet chambers where a queen's body was laid to rest, the torchlight flickering on the walls, while a nation held its breath for what came next. In the ancient kingdom of Mali, Mansa Musa's death is shrouded in mystery, but his legendary pilgrimage and wealth remain unforgettable. Though his exact death date is unclear, historians debate the legacy he left behind. Was it the gold or the spread of Islam that defined his reign? You can imagine the desert winds carrying whispers of a king whose riches were as vast as his empire. Moving to England once more, King Richard III's death in 1485 on the battlefield at Bosworth Field famously ended the Wars of the Roses. His sudden fall sparked Shakespearean drama and centuries of debate. Was he a villain, a hero, or simply a man caught in a brutal power struggle? His rediscovered remains bring the past startlingly close, and you picture the medieval battlefield turning from bloodshed to legend. Switch to the enigmatic death of Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only female emperor. She died peacefully in 705, but her rule was marked by ruthless political maneuvering and reforms. Historians argue whether her reign was a dark tyranny or enlightened governance. You sense the sharp contrast between her formidable persona and her final, quiet breath. Over in the Aztec Empire, Emperor Montezuma II's death was violent and chaotic during the Spanish conquest. Whether killed by his own people or the invaders remains debated. His death symbolizes the fall of a civilization and the clash of worlds. You almost hear the distant echo of war drums fading into silence. In the Scottish Highlands, King James IV died in 1513 at the Battle of Flodden, a devastating loss that reshaped Scotland. His death by battlefield injury is well documented, but historians still argue about the strategic errors leading to the disaster. Imagine the misty moors turning red, the echo of arrows, and the sudden silence that followed. The death of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte in 1821 on Exile Island St. Helena ended one of history's most remarkable reigns. Poisoning theories swirl, but most agree on natural causes, possibly stomach cancer. Historians debate the exact cause, as does the world, fascinated by the fall of such a towering figure. You picture the lonely island, the ocean waves softly breaking as the emperor's story quietly closed. Turning to the Korean peninsula, King Gojong's death in 1919 came amidst colonial pressures and national turmoil. His passing symbolized the end of an era and the struggle for independence. Historians still debate how much his abdication and death influenced Korea's fate. You feel the somber weight of a nation on the brink. Finally, the odd tale of King Ludwig II's ghost is said to haunt his Bavarian castles. His mysterious drowning continues to capture imaginations, blending history and legend. You imagine the quiet halls, the flickering candlelight, and the whispers of a king who never truly left. With these stories settling softly into your thoughts, you're reminded how every royal death carries a story not just of an end, but of the worlds that changed because of it. You're almost at the end of this slow wander through the oddest royal exits, and the quiet hum of history's strange bedfellows is settling like a warm blanket around you. As you ease into these final moments, Imagine the curtain gently closing on monarchs whose deaths carried more than just a headline. They shifted destinies, sparked legends, or faded quietly into the folds of time. Take King Henry VIII of England, who needs little introduction. His death in 1547 marked the end of a reign bursting with drama, from 6 wives to a church reshaped by his whims. Historians still debate how much his physical ailments, possibly diabetes and obesity, contributed to his decline. You can almost smell the heavy scent of musk and candle wax in his chambers as his breath slows and the throne waits for a new occupant. Jump back to the Middle Ages with King Richard the Lionheart, who died in 1199 from an infected arrow wound, sustained during a siege. His death was sudden and violent, but the tales of his bravery and the Crusades live on. Historians still argue about his legacy. Heroic warrior or ruthless conqueror? You picture the battlefield's grim silence replacing the clash of swords. The death of Cleopatra VII of Egypt is shrouded in mystery and myth. Officially, she died by suicide in 30 BCE, possibly from an asp bite. But historians debate whether it was truly suicide or murder. The image of the queen reclining with the snake remains one of history's most evocative, and you can almost feel the desert heat and the dust settling on the Nile. Look to the Roman Empire, where Emperor Nero's suicide in 68 CE ended a notorious reign marked by decadence and persecution. Historians still argue about whether he was a tyrant or a scapegoat. You imagine the twilight shadows of Rome swallowing the last gasp of a ruler desperate to avoid execution. The curious case of King John of England, who died in 1216, possibly from dysentery, reminds you that even kings are mortal. His reign was infamous for the Magna Carta's forced signing, and historians still debate how much his failures contributed to his downfall. Picture the medieval chambers where his sickness quietly crept in. Then there's Queen Victoria, who died peacefully in 1901 after a reign that shaped the modern British Empire. Her death marked the end of an era, but historians still debate the true impact of her personal grief on the monarchy's future. You imagine the soft rustle of mourning black silk filling the palace halls. The tale of Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China, the first emperor, who died in 210 BCE, is steeped in legend. He sought immortality, but died young, possibly from mercury poisoning. Historians still argue about the exact cause, but his death unleashed chaos, leading to the empire's fragmentation. You picture the grandeur of the terracotta army watching silently over his tomb. In Japan, Emperor Jimmu's death is more myth than fact, said to have ascended to heaven in 585 BCE. His story blends history and legend, making him a symbol of imperial divinity. Historians debate how much truth lies in these early chronicles, but the imagery remains powerful. The strange death of King Gustav III of Sweden, who was assassinated at a masquerade ball in 1792, reads like a mystery novel. The stabbing led to a slow, agonizing death, and historians still debate political motives. You can almost hear the eerie echoes of laughter turning to gasps in the candlelit ballroom. Finally, the peaceful death of Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria in 1916 marked the end of a long and complex reign through wars and empire shifts. Historians still discuss how his stubbornness shaped Europe's fate. The quiet passing of this monarch contrasts sharply with the violent ends of so many before him. As your mind settles on these final tales, you feel the gentle reminder that, behind the pomp, pageantry, and power, there's always a human story, complex, strange, and utterly fascinating.